the glittering world of ancient Rome, where marble columns and golden palaces stood as symbols of power, there was a darker reality that history has often chosen to ignore. While we celebrate Rome's military conquests, architectural marvels, and legal innovations, we rarely speak of those who bore the greatest cost to uphold this grandeur. Behind the luxury and wealth, there were young men forced into servitude as male concubines to the powerful and elite of Roman society. These weren't mere servants or slaves carrying out household chores. They were human beings trapped in a system built to exploit their youth, beauty, and vulnerability for the pleasure of the wealthy. Their stories paint a different picture of the Roman Empire, one that challenges the romanticized view of this ancient civilization. It exposes the brutal truth of what it meant to be powerless in a world where strength and status determined everything. The Roman Empire's relationship with intimacy and companionship was vastly different from how we understand it today. While we might draw clear lines between consent and coercion, the Romans viewed it through the lens of hierarchy, where power ruled all. At the bottom of this power structure were the young men, often taken from conquered lands or born into slavery, who found themselves thrust into roles they never asked for. These young men, some barely in their teens, weren't chosen for their intelligence or talents, but for their physical appearance and perceived ability to provide entertainment to their masters. They lived in a constant state of fear and uncertainty, never knowing when they would be summoned, what their masters would demand, or how their survival would hinge on their willingness to comply or refuse. Their lives were shaped by a harsh system designed to strip them of choice and autonomy, turning them into mere objects for the indulgence of Rome's elite. The selection process itself was a stark dehumanization. Wealthy Romans would visit slave markets, much like modern-day people might attend a livestock auction, scrutinizing potential purchases for their physical attributes, age, and origin. Young men from Greece were especially sought after for their perceived refinement and education, while those from Germanic tribes were valued for their fair complexions and robust builds. There was no consideration for the terror these young men must have felt, exposed and vulnerable as strangers bargained over their worth. Once purchased, these male concubines were absorbed into households where their lives were no longer their own. They were expected to be available at all hours, anticipating their master's needs without being asked, maintaining an appearance of willing participation regardless of their true emotions or desires. The psychological toll of this existence cannot be overstated. Imagine the constant strain of being forced to smile and appear grateful while enduring treatment that stripped you of your dignity and autonomy. Every moment of their lives was dictated by the whims of their masters, and their worth was measured solely by their ability to please. The daily routine of a male concubine was shaped by their master's preferences and social standing. Some were kept in luxurious quarters, dressed in fine clothing, and given access to education and cultural activities. However, these privileges always came with a heavy price: their continued subjugation, their unrelenting loss of personal freedom, and their existence as mere commodities, valued only for their youth, beauty, and submission. Others lived in conditions barely better than common slaves, summoned only when their masters desired their company, and then quickly dismissed back to quarters where they had no privacy, no personal possessions, and no hope of escape. Their lives were a cycle of humiliation and invisibility, existing solely to fulfill the whims of those in power. What made their situation particularly tragic was the complete lack of legal protection or recourse. While Roman law provided some protections for citizens and even certain rights for slaves, male concubines existed in a gray area where their masters' desires took precedence over any consideration of their well-being. They had no right to seek help from authorities, couldn't form meaningful relationships with others, and were unable to express their suffering without risking severe punishment. The psychological manipulation these young men endured was perhaps even more damaging than the physical aspects of their servitude. Masters often employed tactics designed to break down their resistance and cultivate a sense of dependence. Some concubines were given special privileges or temporary kindness, only for these gestures to be cruelly withdrawn as punishment for perceived slights. This created a constant state of anxiety and confusion, where every action, every word could mean the difference between favor and retribution. Their existence was marked by fear, uncertainty, and an overwhelming sense of powerlessness, never knowing whether they were in favor or facing the wrath of their masters. The emotional toll of this psychological warfare, constantly navigating the shifting tides of affection and punishment, left lasting scars far deeper than any physical injury. Many masters deliberately isolated their concubines from other household members, ensuring that they could not form friendships or alliances that might offer emotional support. This isolation was particularly cruel for young men who had been torn away from their families and communities, stripping them of any connection to their former identities or cultures. They were left in an unfamiliar world, cut off from everything they had known, with no hope of reclaiming their past lives. The competitive nature of some households added another layer of psychological torment. When masters kept multiple concubines, they often pitted them against one another, competing for attention and privileges. This tactic not only prevented any solidarity among the victims, but also created an atmosphere of constant tension, betrayal, and fear. Young men who might have found comfort in shared experiences instead found themselves in a race for their master's favor, knowing that falling out of favor could mean facing even worse treatment or neglect. The education provided to some concubines, which might seem like an opportunity for advancement, was in fact another form of control. While learning to read, write, and engage in philosophical discussions could have opened doors in other contexts. For these young men, these skills were taught primarily to make them more entertaining companions for their masters. Knowledge, instead of being a path to empowerment, became yet another tool of exploitation, ensuring they could serve their masters more effectively by entertaining them with intellectual conversations or cultural performances. They were expected to discuss literature and politics, but only in ways that pleased their masters. Their education, far from offering opportunities for intellectual growth, was another tool used to mold them into perfect objects for their owner's enjoyment. Physical appearance was rigorously maintained through strict regimens they had no choice but to follow. They were required to exercise regularly, adhere to specific diets, and undergo grooming practices that kept them looking youthful and attractive, meeting the high standards set by their masters. Some were subjected to cosmetic treatments or surgeries to alter their appearance according to their master's preferences. These procedures, performed without modern medical knowledge or pain management, were both dangerous and excruciating, yet they were forced to endure them in pursuit of perfection, as defined by their owners. The clothing and jewelry worn by concubines were not just decorative, but also served as symbols of ownership. Masters took pride in dressing their companions in the finest silks and gold, treating them like living dolls rather than human beings. The irony was that despite being draped in opulence, these young men remained utterly powerless beneath their beautiful trappings, symbols of wealth that highlighted their subjugation. Travel, which might appear to be a privilege, was yet another form of control. Some concubines were taken by their masters on trips to other cities or provinces. However, this travel was never voluntary. They were simply portable property, expected to provide the same services regardless of location, all while adapting to new environments and social situations without complaint. Their journey was dictated by the whims of their masters, and their mobility only served to reinforce their lack of agency and autonomy. The social dynamics within Roman households added even more challenges for male concubines. Though they might live in luxury, they held no real status within the household hierarchy. Other slaves often looked down on them, seeing their role as shameful, while free members of the household treated them as little more than temporary diversions, unworthy of respect or consideration. Their status was an illusion, decorated in finery, yet relegated to the bottom rung of the social ladder, trapped in a life that reduced them to mere objects for pleasure. The impact on families left behind is a painful aspect that should not be overlooked. When young men were taken as concubines, their families often never knew what had become of them. Parents spent years wondering whether their sons were alive or dead, never knowing that they were caught in an inescapable trap. This unknown fate created unimaginable anguish, especially in cultures where family bonds were sacred and community support was essential for survival. The separation was devastating. These families, often torn apart by loss, could only hope for a reunion that would never come. Some concubines were acquired through debt slavery, where families facing financial ruin were forced to give up their sons to pay off debts. These families faced the unimaginable choice between watching all their children starve or sacrificing one son to save the rest. The psychological burden placed on both the families and the young men involved was profound, as everyone knew the gravity of the sacrifice. This wasn't just a financial transaction, it was a brutal, life-altering decision. The few records that exist of concubines attempting to escape reveal desperate young men willing to take enormous risks for the smallest chance of freedom. The punishments for failed escape attempts were severe, and the consequences were often public, designed not only to punish the individual, but to serve as a warning to others. These punishments often involved not just physical pain, but a brutal humiliation, as masters sought to demonstrate their absolute control over their property, stripping away even the smallest shred of dignity from their victims. Some concubines, driven to the brink by their suffering, tried to end their lives through suicide, but even this final escape was often denied to them. Masters who had invested significant sums in purchasing and maintaining their concubines took extreme measures to prevent this loss of property. They implemented constant supervision, ensuring that their concubines had no access to objects that could be used for self-harm. The strict control over every aspect of their lives included removing even the smallest means of escape, trapping them in an existence where death was no more attainable than freedom. The religious aspects of Roman society provided no comfort for these young men. While Romans worshipped gods associated with protection and justice, these divine protections did not extend to male concubines. Though some sought solace in foreign religions or mystery cults, even these spiritual practices had to be conducted in secrecy. Masters often controlled every aspect of their concubines' lives, including their religious beliefs, leaving them with no avenue for spiritual refuge or emotional release. The economic value placed on concubines further entrenched their exploitation, creating a market that encouraged the continued capture and sale of young men. Wealthy Romans competed with each other to acquire the most beautiful or talented companions, driving up prices and creating an incentive for traders to continually supply this gruesome demand. The commodification of human beings reached its peak in these transactions, where young men's lives were reduced to mere monetary calculations, their worth measured solely in gold and silver. Training schools existed specifically to prepare young men for lives as concubines, much like gladiator schools prepared fighters for the arena. These institutions were as brutal as they were profitable. They systematically broke down the personalities and resistance of their students, molding them into the perfect servants for their future masters. These schools didn't just teach the physical skills expected by their masters, they stripped away any sense of autonomy, dignity, or hope, ensuring that the concubines would be entirely dependent on their owners, both physically and mentally. The curriculum in these training schools was not just about physical conditioning. It also included psychological manipulation designed to create compliant, attractive companions. The age at which young men were thrust into this life varied, but many were still children when their fates were sealed. The developmental impact of growing up in such circumstances cannot be overstated. These boys were robbed of the opportunity to form normal relationships, explore their own interests, or even understand what healthy human connections might look like. Their entire existence was molded around meeting the desires of others, leaving them with little sense of self or identity. training schools existed specifically to prepare young men for lives as concubines, much like gladiator schools prepared fighters for the arena. These institutions were as brutal as they were profitable. They systematically broke down the personalities and resistance of their students, molding them into the perfect servants for their future masters. These schools didn't just teach the physical skills expected by their masters, they stripped away any sense of autonomy, dignity, or hope, ensuring that the concubines would be entirely dependent on their owners, both physically and mentally. The curriculum in these training schools was not just about physical conditioning. It also included psychological manipulation designed to create compliant, attractive companions. The age at which young men were thrust into this life varied, but many were still children when their fates were sealed. The developmental impact of growing up in such circumstances cannot be overstated. These boys were robbed of the opportunity to form normal relationships, explore their own interests, or even understand what healthy human connections might look like. Their entire existence was molded around meeting the desires of others, leaving them with little sense of self or identity. The rare success stories of former concubines, though inspiring, also underscored just how unusual it was for anyone to escape the system unscathed. These individuals often had to rebuild their lives from the ground up, burying the painful truths of their pasts and struggling to overcome the deep psychological scars of their earlier experiences. Their survival was not a testament to the system's ability to offer redemption, but rather to their extraordinary resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. Medical care for concubines, when provided, was not out of compassion, but to preserve their value as property. Masters wanted to keep their investments healthy and attractive, so they offered medical attention as needed. However, this care was strictly limited to maintaining physical appearance and function, with no consideration given to the psychological toll of their lives or the long-term health consequences of their treatment. Their bodies were tools, not individuals, and once their physical appeal began to fade, so too did their worth. The social acceptance of this system among Roman elites reveals much about the moral framework of ancient Rome. While Romans prided themselves on concepts like honor, duty, and virtue, these ideals seemingly only applied to free citizens of appropriate social status. The suffering of concubines was regarded as irrelevant to moral calculations, an oversight that highlights how completely these young men had been dehumanized in Roman society. Their pain, their humiliation, their broken spirits were simply of no consequence to the powerful, who saw them as nothing more than objects to be used and discarded. Some concubines developed what we might now recognize as survival strategies. They learned to read their master's moods, anticipate their desires, and navigate the complex social dynamics of their households. These skills, while helping them avoid the worst punishments, also required them to become expert actors, constantly performing contentment, gratitude, and willingness, all the while suppressing their true emotions. This forced performance of submission became part of their daily existence, a constant battle to hide their true feelings in order to maintain their survival. Roman social life itself, with its seasonal cycles of celebration and festival, further shaped the experiences of concubines. During major festivals, concubines might be expected to participate in elaborate entertainments, their presence an important part of the spectacle. In quieter times, there might be brief respites from constant attention, but even then, anxiety always loomed. They could never relax, never fully feel free, as they remained at the mercy of their master's whims, dreading the moment they would next be summoned to perform. The weight of constant uncertainty, the pressure to maintain the facade of contentment, and the fear of losing favor never truly left them. Communication between concubines and other slaves was often strictly controlled, but when possible, these young men developed their own networks of support and information. They learned to communicate through subtle gestures and coded language, passing along warnings about their master's moods or offering comfort during difficult times. These covert connections, while necessarily secretive, became a crucial source of emotional support in an otherwise isolating and oppressive existence. In a world where trust was a luxury and survival depended on constant vigilance, these small acts of solidarity became lifelines. The impact of this system extended far beyond its immediate victims, shaping Roman society as a whole. The normalization of treating human beings as objects for the pleasure of the elite contributed to a broader culture of exploitation and dehumanization. This cultural acceptance of cruelty made it easier for Romans to justify other forms of violence and oppression. From the bloodthirsty gladiatorial games to the brutal suppression of slave revolts, the widespread acceptance of exploitation and the belief in the inherent superiority of the powerful pervaded every facet of Roman life. This cultural mindset reinforced the idea that those without power existed solely for the benefit of those who held it. Archaeological evidence provides rare glimpses into the lives of these forgotten victims. Artifacts found in wealthy Roman households suggest objects likely used to control or monitor concubines, as well as personal items that offer faint hints about their daily experiences. Yet much of the physical evidence of their existence has been lost to time, just as their voices were silenced during their lives. The literary references to male concubines in Roman writings are often brief, euphemistic, or veiled in subtlety, reflecting the author's desire to acknowledge these relationships without confronting their more disturbing realities. Between the lines of these texts, the true horrors of their existence are obscured, leaving us with only fragments of their stories, buried beneath the weight of Rome's self-perpetuating power. However, we can still discern the harsh reality of their lives, defined by powerlessness and exploitation. The transition periods when concubines were sold from one master to another were particularly traumatic. These transitions meant facing the uncertainty of new households, different expectations, and unknown levels of cruelty or kindness. Each move forced them to start over, learning how to survive in a new environment while maintaining the psychological defenses that had kept them alive in their previous situation. The constant upheaval exacerbated the deep emotional toll, making survival a continual struggle. Some masters treated their concubines as mere temporary diversions, quickly losing interest in them and either selling them off or relegating them to the status of ordinary household slaves. Others formed long-term attachments which, though still exploitative, provided some degree of stability and predictability. However, neither situation offered true security, as the fate of the concubines was always entirely dependent on their master's whims. Their lives remained in a constant state of vulnerability, shaped by the changing moods and desires of those who held power over them. The seasonal migration of wealthy Romans between their urban houses and country villas meant that many concubines spent their lives moving between different environments and social contexts. This constant movement required tremendous psychological flexibility, forcing them to adapt quickly to new situations. But it also prevented them from ever establishing roots, forming lasting connections with places or people. Their lives were marked by displacement, unable to find true belonging, constantly adjusting to the whims of their master's journeys. The education provided to concubines in music, poetry, and conversation created a cruel irony. They were taught to appreciate beauty and culture, yet were denied any opportunity to create or contribute to these fields themselves. They became living repositories of artistic knowledge and skill, but always in service to others' enjoyment. Their talents, like their bodies, were commodified, existing only to please those who owned them, never to express their own desires or dreams. Physical training regimens imposed on concubines were designed to maintain their appeal to their masters. These programs, often extreme and punishing, were inescapable. The young men had no choice but to endure whatever exercise, dietary restrictions, or body modifications their masters demanded, regardless of the physical or psychological cost. The toll was immense, but survival depended on their ability to conform to these grueling routines. The seasonal celebrations and festivals of Roman society added another layer of pressure for concubines. who were often expected to participate in elaborate entertainments or private celebrations. These events, while an opportunity for the elite to indulge, were simply another arena in which concubines were expected to perform, further entrenching their roles as objects of desire rather than individuals. The glamour of Roman festivities concealed the deep isolation and suffering that these young men endured, forced to play their part in a world that saw them as little more than accessories to the wealthy's pleasures. These events, though seemingly festive from the outside, represented additional opportunities for humiliation and exploitation for the concubines involved. While the lavish celebrations may have appeared glamorous, they were, for the concubines, another platform for their subjugation. They were expected to perform, entertain, and please, always under the watchful eyes of their masters, never allowed the freedom to simply exist as themselves. For them, these occasions were often a stark reminder of their role as objects for others' enjoyment, with little to no agency over their own lives. The development of personal relationships between concubines and other household members was complicated by the ambiguous nature of their status. While they might live in relative luxury compared to other slaves, everyone understood that their position depended entirely on their master's favor. This constant uncertainty made genuine friendship or romance nearly impossible. Trust was a luxury these young men couldn't afford. Any connection that might form was often fragile, as the threat of being discarded or replaced hung over them constantly. Relationships were secondary to their primary function as possessions. The regional trade networks that supplied young men to serve as concubines stretched across the entire Mediterranean world and beyond. This system created incentives for warfare, kidnapping, and debt slavery, as traders scrambled to meet the demand from wealthy Roman households. The human cost of maintaining this supply chain was enormous, affecting not only the victims, but entire communities and cultures. Families were torn apart, villages were raided, and individuals were sold into a life of unimaginable suffering, all to sustain the demands of the Roman elite. The training and conditioning of concubines went far beyond learning specific skills. It involved systematic psychological manipulation designed to break down their resistance and create a complete dependency on their masters. Masters and their agents became expert at identifying and exploiting psychological weaknesses, using techniques that would today be recognized as forms of systematic abuse. This manipulation wasn't just about obedience. It was about ensuring that the concubines were mentally and emotionally incapable of escaping, teaching them to view themselves as inferior and worthy only of serving others. The clothing and ornamentation of concubines served multiple purposes beyond decoration. These items were a constant reminder of their status and lack of autonomy. While their clothing and accessories marked them as possessions, they also demonstrated their master's wealth and taste, a visual representation of their owner's power over them. Even their physical appearance was not their own to control. The beauty and elegance they were forced to display were crafted entirely for the pleasure of others, leaving them with no space to define their own sense of self. Every piece of fabric, every jewel was a symbol of their subjugation, beautiful on the outside, but a constant reminder of their imprisonment. The medical and grooming practices imposed on concubines were often invasive, painful, and sometimes permanently disfiguring. These procedures were carried out without regard for the concubines' consent or comfort, treating their bodies as mere objects to be modified according to their master's preferences, whether it was cosmetic alterations or painful grooming routines. These practices were designed solely to enhance their appeal, without any consideration for their well-being. The psychological impact of growing up or spending formative years in such circumstances left deep, lasting scars. These young men were never given the opportunity to develop normal concepts of consent, autonomy, or healthy relationships. Instead, their lives were marked by manipulation, subjugation, and the constant erosion of their personal dignity. This created an emotional and psychological landscape that made recovery extremely difficult, even for those who eventually gained their freedom. The damage to their sense of self and their ability to form healthy relationships was profound and enduring. Social isolation was another key aspect of their existence, as many concubines were deliberately cut off from the rest of society. This isolation prevented them from developing the social skills and connections that might have helped them survive or escape their situations. Masters went to great lengths to ensure that their property could not form alliances, receive support from others, or seek help. By keeping them isolated, masters further entrenched their control, making it nearly impossible for concubines to find any form of refuge or escape. The economic calculations that determined the fates of concubines reduced their existence to a simple monetary value. Prices fluctuated based on factors like age, appearance, skills, and origin. This commodification of human beings made it easier for masters to justify treating them as disposable objects, valuable only for their immediate usefulness and appeal. Their worth, determined by these cold calculations, stripped them of any sense of humanity, making it easier for society to view them as property rather than as individuals deserving of dignity, respect, and freedom. The impact on Roman society of normalizing such a high level of exploitation and dehumanization extended far beyond the immediate victims. A culture that could accept the systematic abuse of vulnerable young men was also more prepared to tolerate other forms of cruelty and injustice. This culture of exploitation contributed to the broader pattern of oppression that characterized much of Roman history. From the treatment of slaves to the brutal spectacle of gladiatorial games, the systemic dehumanization of individuals in Roman society set a precedent that would be difficult to overcome, reinforcing the idea that power, privilege, and wealth were above all else. The few glimpses we have of resistance and rebellion among concubines reveal the desperate measures some took to assert their humanity and dignity. These acts of defiance, though often futile and met with severe punishment, demonstrate that the human spirit could not be completely crushed, even under the most oppressive and dehumanizing conditions. The drive to preserve some sense of self-worth and autonomy, even in the face of overwhelming power, speaks to the strength of the human will. The religious and philosophical systems of Rome, while deeply complex and rich in their ethical debates, provided no meaningful protection or comfort for these victims. While Romans debated questions of virtue and honor, there was a stark disconnect between these lofty ideals and the reality of widespread exploitation. The suffering of concubines was ignored, and their plight did not challenge the moral framework of a society that saw them as nothing more than property to be used, manipulated, and discarded. The seasonal rhythms of Roman social life created predictable patterns of exploitation. Certain times of the year brought increased demands on concubines' time and energy, especially during grand celebrations or festivals when the wealthy elite indulged in their excesses. These periods were marked by heightened expectations, with concubines expected to perform or entertain, providing their masters with the pleasures and diversions they sought. These routines, while seemingly cyclical, only deepened the sense of powerlessness and exhaustion, as their lives were entirely dictated by the seasons of luxury and indulgence that belonged to others. These patterns of exploitation meant that even during relatively quiet periods, concubines lived with the constant knowledge that busier and more demanding times were approaching. The cyclical nature of their lives, marked by moments of brief respite followed by intense, grueling demands, ensured that their sense of relief was always temporary. They could never escape the reality of being constantly at the mercy of their master's whims, with no certainty of rest or reprieve. The impact of this system on the families and communities from which concubines were taken cannot be overlooked. The loss of young men to this trade affected not only the immediate victims, but entire social networks. Families were torn apart, and entire communities felt the disruption caused by the Roman demand for human labor and pleasure. This exploitation was part of the broader suffering caused by Roman expansion. as the empire's insatiable need for resources led to the destruction and destabilization of countless lives. The training and preparation of concubines involved systematic, brutal techniques designed to break down their psychological defenses and create compliance. These methods, refined over generations, were finely tuned to ensure maximum obedience and submission. The system was efficient in its cruelty, devastating in its impact, and nearly impossible to escape. These young men were not only forced into physical subjugation, but systematically stripped of their identity, their humanity, and their spirit. The conditioning they underwent was not just about their bodies. It was about controlling their minds and souls, ensuring they would never question their status as mere property. The legal framework of Roman society provided no meaningful protection for concubines. They were treated as property, not as persons with rights or agency. This legal invisibility ensured that their suffering went unnoticed and unacknowledged. Masters acted with complete impunity, knowing that the law would not hold them accountable for their exploitation and abuse of those they owned. Meanwhile, society at large looked the other way, either indifferent or complicit in the normalization of such cruelty. The economic incentives that drove this system created a self-perpetuating cycle of exploitation. The profits from trading in human beings fueled the continued capture and abuse of young men, perpetuating the demand for more victims to satisfy the desires of the wealthy. Breaking this cycle would have required profound changes to Roman society and its values, changes that, tragically, never came. The entrenched power structures that allowed this system to thrive remained unchallenged, and the brutal exploitation of vulnerable individuals continued without end. The physical and psychological conditioning imposed on concubines was designed to create perfect compliance. Obedient bodies and minds that served their master's needs without question. But the human cost of this conditioning was enormous. Young men were systematically stripped of their autonomy, their dignity, and their sense of self. For many, this damage was permanent, and they never fully recovered. Even if they eventually gained their freedom, the scars of their past endured, often leaving them broken, isolated, and unable to find a place in a society that had never truly seen them as human. These essential aspects of humanity, hope, fear, dreams, were systematically stripped from the concubines of ancient Rome. Even if some eventually gained freedom, the psychological scars from their experiences remained, preventing them from ever truly recovering. As we reflect on these forgotten stories of suffering and survival, we must remember that behind every historical statistic was a real human being whose life was marked by pain, exploitation, and lost potential. The concubines of ancient Rome were not mere footnotes to history. They were individuals whose experiences offer important insights into power, exploitation, and human resilience. Their stories challenge us to look beyond the marble facades and golden treasures of ancient Rome and confront the human cost of this civilization's grandeur. The towering columns and opulent wealth often overshadow the brutal reality faced by those who paid the price for such luxury. These stories remind us that historical progress, particularly in societies that have achieved great power, often came at the expense of the most vulnerable members of that society. Those whose voices were silenced, whose bodies were commodified, and whose lives were expendable. The systematic nature of their exploitation underscores how easily societies can normalize and institutionalize cruelty when it serves the interests of the powerful. The Romans' ability to maintain elaborate philosophical and legal systems that prided themselves on ideals of justice and virtue while simultaneously operating a vast network of human trafficking, illustrates how selective moral reasoning can become when it threatens to challenge existing power structures. These contradictions within Roman society expose the dark undercurrent of its success, showing how cruelty can be masked by grandeur and intellectualism. But despite the cruelty, the resilience of the human spirit shines through. These young men's experiences, though filled with suffering, also highlight an incredible ability to endure. Despite circumstances designed to break them completely, many still found ways to survive. Sometimes through quiet defiance, sometimes through small acts of rebellion, and sometimes by simply enduring the unimaginable. Their survival, in whatever form it took, is a testament to the strength of the human will, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Their stories, forgotten by much of history, offer us an opportunity to reflect on the costs of power, the value of human dignity, and the enduring fight for freedom. Many concubines found ways to maintain a sense of self and dignity despite the overwhelming forces that sought to strip them of their humanity. Their small acts of resistance, moments of connection with others, and their sheer determination to survive were triumphs of the human spirit over systematic dehumanization. These acts, while often minor in the grand scale of their lives, represented a defiance against a system designed to break them completely. Understanding their stories allows us to recognize similar patterns of exploitation and abuse in our own time. While the specific forms of oppression may have changed, the underlying dynamics of power, vulnerability, and systematic abuse remain disturbingly relevant today. Their experiences serve as a cautionary tale, warning us of what can happen when societies allow the powerful to treat others as mere objects for their pleasure and profit. The silence that has surrounded these stories for so long reflects our ongoing discomfort with acknowledging the full extent of historical injustices. By bringing these forgotten voices back into historical consciousness, we honor their memory and remind ourselves of our obligation to prevent such systemic abuse from occurring again. The concubines of ancient Rome lived and died in circumstances no human being should ever have to endure. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not as titillating historical curiosities, but as testaments to human suffering and resilience. In remembering them, we acknowledge their humanity and reaffirm our commitment to building a world where such exploitation becomes impossible. Their legacy challenges us to examine our own society's treatment of its most vulnerable members, urging us to reflect on what future historians might uncover about the injustices we choose to ignore or accept today. The questions their stories raise about power, consent, and human dignity remain just as pertinent now as they were 2,000 years ago. In the end, the horrific lives of male concubines in the Roman Empire serve as a stark reminder that civilization's greatest achievements often rest on foundations built upon unspeakable cruelty. By understanding and acknowledging this painful truth, we honor those who suffered, and we commit ourselves to ensuring that such systematic dehumanization never again becomes the hidden price of progress and prosperity.